thank you very much, Leila, and thank you to MEP Karim for inviting me here. I'm mainly going to focus on the EU's response to the Syrian refugee crisis, a little bit on the situation of refugees and IDPs in the neighbourhood, but I'm going to start with some numbers. According to UNHCR, there is nearly today 66 million people around the world who have been forced from their homes. Among them are nearly 22 million refugees, and over half of this number are under the age of 18. An estimated 34,000 people are forcibly displaced every day as a result of conflict and persecution. I mean, 34,000 every day, that's a staggering number. I mean, I personally can't imagine what it must be like to be a refugee or an IDP, to have your life totally, ripped apart, everything that you've known disappear overnight, not knowing if you're ever, when or if ever you're going to be able to go home. Now, I have a very good friend from Cyprus. He was made a refugee back in 1974, when around 200,000 Cypriots had to flee their homes. He ran from his house that night thinking that maybe a couple of weeks later he'd be going home. He didn't take anything. But still today, he's actually waiting to go back. And this is, 5 decades on nearly. So we can see this is something that can, take over a lifetime. And of course, Europe is no stranger to refugees and IDPs. During the 20th century, Europe has seen some of the largest waves of refugees and violent forced migrations in human history, particularly if we look at the First and Second World Wars, and they've dealt with them in a very humanitarian way. We know that from history. And more recently we had the wars in the Balkans in the early 1990s, and this also led to the largest displacement Europe had seen since the Second World War. And turning to the Caucasus, in the conflicts in the Caucasus, South Ossetia, Abkhazia and Nagorno-Karabakh, these conflicts also left hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis, Armenians and Georgians as IDPs and refugees. And as we just heard, they stay or remain displaced until today. And of course it happened during a period of war when the Soviet Union was breaking up. So it was also a very challenging period to actually become a refugee or an IDP, because it clearly presented a huge social challenge to the newly independent states. And we also know that since then there have been more IDPs created in this region, first because of the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, and there's a risk that more could come. I mean, if the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict was to, let's say, spiral out of control again, we could possibly foresee another wave of IDPs and refugees. So as we just heard as well, I mean, it's crucial that perhaps there's more international focus placed on efforts to resolve this conflict, particularly following the 4-day war earlier this year. And I just also want to say a word about Ukraine, because Russia's annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass, this left nearly 1.8 million Ukrainians displaced. I mean, it's hard to imagine that this could have happened, but the figure 1.8 million, I mean, it's huge. I mean, Ukraine now ranks in 4th position among the countries with the highest number of IDPs in the world, and this is staggering. And this is a country that's, basically a stone's throw away from us. And if you actually look at the response of the international community to that, it's quite minimalistic. Now, just turning to Syria, the ongoing civil war in Syria, and not only Syria, as we know, has led to the largest humanitarian crisis we have seen again since the Second World War. I mean, it's resulted in the displacement of more than 50% of the country's pre-war 22 million population. 4.8 million have fled to neighbouring states, and at least half of this number are children. Now, we know as well that 3 countries have taken the brunt of the flow and continue to do so, despite the fact that it's putting an increasing humanitarian, economic and social strain on these countries, and they've received, considerably insufficient support from the international community. I mean, the London conference was mentioned just before. If you actually look what was promised to Jordan and Lebanon in this conference and what's actually being delivered is actually really embarrassing. I mean, it's shameful. It's a tiny percentage. And the situation could have been much better if the international community had fully funded the UNHCR Syria Refugee Response Plan rather than just providing 35% of the requested budget in 2015. Now, in Lebanon, you have just over 1 million refugees, but this basically means that 1 out of every 5 people in Lebanon is a refugee. I mean, this is a significant amount of people. In Jordan, 656,000, and these are 2 of the smallest countries in the Middle East being, asked to cope with a very difficult situation, which isn't sustainable. And in Turkey, as we know, the official number is 2.8 million. It's probably much, much more than that because this is a registered number. And again, Turkey is coping. Sometimes we hear more negative things about Turkey than positive things, but in terms of the migration crisis, I think they've done an excellent job. And we also should remember you have in Iraq, where you already have 3.9 million people displaced. There you have nearly 250,000 refugees from Syria, and also in Egypt. So the region is hosting most of the refugees, and probably these numbers are lower than they actually are. When you come to the EU, I'm embarrassed, frankly speaking, about the EU's response to the crisis. I mean, it's been grossly inadequate, and it's been really shameful. I mean, my country, the UK, I'm ashamed, totally ashamed of the British response to this crisis, particularly given, the UK's history as a country that has such a multicultural identity. And you have to ask yourself, what would have been the situation, if the body of Alain Kurdi, which was washed up in the beach in Bodrum 14 months ago, because up until that point, the EU was more or less satisfied just to travel to Turkey, tell the Turks, okay, you're doing a job, and come back, and didn't really think too much about it. Turkey was basically left to carry most of the burden, which tells you a lot. And I would say that the EU's response actually contributed to the crisis because of the lack of political will to be able to reconcile internal differences and respond adequately. Because I said the EU hasn't responded adequately, it hasn't, and it still isn't. They failed to come up with a joint effort to have a European policy, despite the best efforts of Angela Merkel, and she did have, I would say, the right approach. Germany, out of all of the countries, has been the most proactive in terms of trying to find a reply, but they haven't been able to reach a joint effort. Rather than find a common policy, they outsourced. The problem, and we know this led to the Turkey EU deal, which came out on the 17th of March. So this deal, together with the Balkan route being blocked, has helped reduce the flow. But we also know that key elements in this deal are not being fully implemented, and this also includes, and again, very embarrassing, the fact that the EU still hasn't been able to reach the figures that are penned in this agreement regarding to resettlement. And I'm just coming to the end. The migration crisis has strained the unity of the EU. It's been unfortunately used as a political tool for the far right and populist groups in Europe. It sparked a debate about the difference between Western and Eastern Europe, and it's actually posed a question, or difficult questions, as to what has happened to the Europe of humanism, a champion of human rights, democracy and freedom, and the EU's adherence to European values, because I really don't see very much of this. And I also think that if the EU doesn't find a way to turn this picture around, if they don't meet their commitments, if they don't have a more, let's say, open embrace to these poor refugees and IDPs, it's going to cast, a really dark shadow over the EU and its credibility, far into the future. It's awful to think. Populations in Europe were originally very, emphatic when they saw Alain Kurdi washed up on the beach. There was an outpouring of sympathy from many populations around Europe, but now when you look at it, it's totally been turned on its head. European populations, European politicians don't want to have Syrian refugees or migrants from the region, and I think this is a really negative and terrible approach that needs to be turned around and done so quicker rather than later, because this crisis isn't going to be ending in the near future. So thank you.
Thank you.